Hello, everybody. This is Grandmaster Bryan with chesslecture.com, and today we'll be seeing the second part of my series on Carlsen's games from the Isle of Man Masters tournament, recently completed, which was won by Carlsen. In the first part, we saw his first round game against a much lower-rated player. We're skipping the second round game, which can be found. Which he played against fellow lecturer Eugene Perelstein, so he's planning to analyze that game, so you should be able to find it on the site. And now we're going to be covering the third round game. So his opponent here was already a very strong GM, Jeffrey Xiong, young American player, 26-33 FIDE, so very promising and probably will be a future 2,700 plus player. Carlsen had the white pieces. So again, knight 3, c5. Xiong's probably hoping to get into a Sicilian, but Carlsen didn't oblige and played this obscure little move c3, typical kind of thing that he likes. It's not leaving theory, obviously, at this point. It's going to transpose into one of various openings, but it's going to be some sort of quiet setup where there will be a real game of chess and not a lot of concrete theory. Xiong chose knight f6, and now d4. So white is heading into kind of a d-pawn opening, and black preferred to place e6. So he could also transpose into an exchange Slav by trading on d4, playing d5. Some people might choose that, but Xiong chose to play e6. Now the game became a Torre attack, bishop g5. With this specific move order, black played d5. It was also possible to once again to transpose into an exchange Slav type of line, with white having lost a few options. You could chase the bishop, for instance, takes d5. And then bishop e7, and later trade the darks for bishops. This was possible, so black decided to stick in the Torre system with d5, and now e3 white played, and here h6. So I think there are some justifications for driving the bishop back, but in most cases this move h6 becomes a weakness, becomes a detrimental to black's game, and in this game it was fairly clearly, as we'll see, detrimental to black's game. This little pawn move, it makes a big difference, actually. It may seem not the biggest relevance at this point in the game, whether you leave the bishop on g5 or chase it back to h4, but we'll see that how important this factor becomes as the game goes on. So I think most people tend to avoid h6, although it can be connected with some specific plans that we'll see in a little bit. Most common, I think, this main line, at least, in this relatively obscure opening, is what was played in a famous game between Spassky and Petrosian from the World Championship 1966. The transposition will reach the position in a couple of moves, but one way to reach it would be knight b to d7, knight to d2, knight b to d2, bishop e7. So simply putting the knight on d7, the bishop on e7, give bishop d3, b6, then black pinko's this bishop, castle, bishop b7, and now white needs to somehow define a plan, so usually they go knight e5, because it's hard otherwise to say what white's doing when black's ready to stop e4. It's not very effective for white to play e4, and black's also getting ready maybe at some point to jump into e4 outpost himself. So usually white goes knight e5, takes, knight to d7. This was the famous game Spassky-Petrosian, which Petrosian won in very nice style as black. After white played bishop f4 here, it's probably better to take on e7, but this is a very solid setup. f4, and white plays e4, but there's some exchanges later, and more or less somewhere around equal. So that's probably the most solid response to this version of the Torre attack. But Xiong chose h6, bishop h4, knight c6, knight d2, and now a6. Very Well, it stops the bishop from going to b5, but it's kind of almost otherwise a little bit random move. Bishop doesn't always go to b5 anyway, but in such a quiet line, it's possible to play this moves like this. Now bishop d3, and here's one point where what actually happened in when of course very few games have reached this position, especially considering how obscure the move a6 is. But Black's play kind of has some logic after c takes d4, e takes d4, and then g5, bishop g3, knight h5. Kind of a risky approach, but taking this bishop can be can actually have a lot of value. And then Black puts the bishop on g7 and has two bishops kind of in a solid position. It's not easy to exploit the weakness of Black's king side. And as the game opens up, the dark squares in White's position can become vulnerable. So this was an enterprising option, but Black chose very solid, just bishop e7, castles, and now knight d7. So he looks to exchange the bishops, again playing very solidly, just to relieve some of the pressure on his game by making some exchanges. And Carlsen chose to capture. It was also worth considering keeping this bishop. Looks interesting to me. The bishop's on a good diagonal on g3. e4 is White's plan. And the knight on d7 now doesn't have much of a purpose. So maybe Black might be able to play c4 and f5, something like this, but White can try some ways to open up the game, I think, on the queen side in particular, with bishop aiming controlling b8. White can try b3, for instance. Okay, so that might have been why Carlsen with bishop g3, but at least it looks like also an interesting option. But instead he took on e7. Black took with the knight, because queen takes e7, e4 is a bit of a problem, because there's a threat to open the e-file with a black queen on it, and White's pieces will be a little bit more active here, results in position. So Black chose knight e7, which of course is not really ideal. It would be better to keep the knight on the c6 square, but this at least makes e4 a lot less dangerous, although Carlsen still could have played e4 here, and I think this move promises some advantage for White also. Actually, I think this is clearly better than the move he played. It looks at least like the move he played is not. We'll see that in a second. But e4, White certainly can count on some small advantage, a little bit more active pieces, a little bit more development. So it's kind of uncomfortable for Black. But Carlsen chose knight e5, and surprisingly, Black took on d4, which his plan is to take on e5, which is what he did. He took on d4, e takes d4, knight d5. Now this pawn is easily supported, and contrary to the position with the pawns on c5 and e3, White's pawns are less weak. So that's kind of a strange decision. He may have been concerned in this kind of position about White's pawn break e4. However, it's not really as big of a problem as it might seem. And here Black can play knight c6, and White already has to see how he's going to defend the e5 pawn. So knight c6, and if f4, then there's a major problem that Black can play c4 and queen b6, attacking e3 and b2. So this is a problem for White. And if knight f3, on the other hand, and queen c7, and Black once again attacks the pawn, and White can't save it. So that this would have posed some problem. Also, there's queen g4 attacking g7 in response, and then White could go then knight f3 if Black just defends. But queen g5 would be a good response here, and White would have to trade queens, and the ending would be very good for Black. So I think that this would kind of just draw into some suspicion White's to move knight e5. But instead, Black first exchanged on d4, which was a significant inaccuracy. E takes c4, knight takes e5, d takes e5. Now there's no real problem with defending this pawn, and White just has looks starting to look like a French defense, but a nice version for white. White has a persistent advantage here. Black played bishop d7. Of course, knight c6 now is not really a problem because rook e1, for instance. Black begin with bishop d7, rook e1 anyway, and now rook c8. So black had castle, but he delays castling for a long time because there's some threat to the black king here. White would probably play knight f3, and then there's this idea of bishop c2 and queen to d3, which isn't that easy for black to meet. It kind of can force weaknesses in the black king's side, and white has a lot of resources to attack. Or it's also possible to bring the rook first with rook e3. That's also worth considering. So black chose instead to try to get some counterplay on the queen's side before castling. So we can rook c8, knight f3, b5. So black gains that b4 pawn break. If bishop b5, then this pawn is going to be very weak. I think I can just exchange and then eventually win the pawn on b5. So exchange of knights for bishops isn't worth that for black. So he plays b5. And now, kind of unusual looking move h4. This was real interesting. Carlsen played a couple of moves here which are very colorful. This knight e5 move, first of all, which is probably not the most direct move and probably not even the best move. And then this move, which is, well, this move is not bad, but it's also not the first move that comes to mind either. You might start thinking about establishing control on the queen's side, preventing b4. But Carlsen instead played h4 with the idea to eventually cramp black's kingside. And when black's castle, we'll see later, this becomes part of his plan to advance the kingside pawns. But also, he wants to just control this knight, and maybe even in the future, once things are settled, then knight d4 and queen to g4 to further attack the king's side. So this was interesting move. Also, he stops maybe some possibilities of g5, and it's questionable whether this would be effective. But in case of h4, black continued on the queen's side with a5. Planning b4, and white played a3 to try to stop that. Now queen to b6, black persists in trying to play b4, queen to d2, and now finally black played b4, which was an interesting try. He didn't want to just go into passive position, because if castles, probably knight to b4, and now it's too late to go b4. White would just take, and this of course can't be captured because bishop h7, and if black takes, then queen takes, and black doesn't. Well, the knight is hanging on e7, so black has to trade queens, and then he doesn't get any. If white gets b5 and black doesn't get any real counterplay, and if knight c6, white can trade, and the extra pawn in this situation should be sufficient to win the game, especially with black's bishop not being a very good piece. So black played b4 immediately, basically sacrificing a pawn for counterplay. And so now white took on b4, he takes b4, and here, interesting choice, a4. So it was possible to capture the pawn, queen takes b4, but in this position and c6, black gets threatening the pawn, and it's not easy for white to deal with that, because also knight to b4 is coming next. If b5, for instance, knight to b4, and this is threatening the bishop, and there's a fork on c2 if the bishop retreats, and that pawn is hanging, so that's no good for white. But it's awkward to protect this pawn. However, there is this move rook e to c1, and black can't take on b4 because of the trade, and bishop b5, and if bishop d7, rook a8. And if black moves the king, then rook a4 traps, will eventually traps the knight, because knight c2, bishop d3, and the knight becomes trapped, bishop e7, e8 check. So there's this move rook e to c1. Black, however, can play king e7, connect his rooks, and once again threaten to take the pawn on b4. White has b5, knight to b4, and now bishop f1, so he's able to stop black's threats, but still, black still has counterplay here. Rook to b8, for instance, threatening this pawn, and the other rook will come to c8, or actually he can maybe better better to challenge the A file. It's rook to A8. It's basically still a very tricky endgame. So Carlsen chose to instead just play A4, going instead to dominate the queen's side, which was probably a good practical choice. He wants to, well, he establishes a passed pawn, which could be useful in the future. He controls b5, so he's stopping bishop b5 moves, and he aims to put the knight maybe on d4 and basically create a bind on the queen side. Furthermore, the pawn on b4 is not, the pawn on b4 requires defense. So a4. So now black played rook a8, attacking the pawn on a4, trying to induce the move b3. So I think that this was actually a pretty good move, and we'll see that inducing b3 allows black to get counterplay later. Otherwise, if he just played just castles or whatever, then knight to d4, I think, and white would obtain a very strong bind. The rook to a8, but here, so b3 was what Carlsen played. It's hard to see, but there's this move bishop to b5, with the point that after black takes, then queen takes b4. And white wins the pawn, and black doesn't quite get enough compensation for it. So that's not that easy to see. Of course, if black doesn't take the bishop, he has some big problems. That's hanging, and white's ready to make the black king move. So, however, b3 is what Carlsen played. Black now castled, and rook a is c1. So white's now taking the c-file. Black challenged rook f to c8. Actually, black is the one that's going to control the c-file. And the queen side at this point is somewhat of a nuisance to white because of this. Basically, black constantly threatens to come into c3. So here, now h5, white played. So he aims to begin an attack on the king's side, as we'll see, g4, g5. So he first fixes the h-pawn. And here, black played the move king f8, which prepares maybe to evacuate the king, but also steps away from this bishop h7, so that now knight d4 is stopped. However, this wasn't the best move. It was best time to it was time to already to play rook c3. So that's and sacrifice a pawn temporarily to open the queen side and gain counterplay before white's kingside threats get too serious. So it was crucial, really, to find this movement, to find the idea. I don't know if we had the idea yet, but to also to play it immediately before white gets anywhere on the king side, because the attack is surprisingly fast on the king side. So after rook c3, black's plan, of course, is rook a to c8 with immediate counterplay, also just to take the b pawn. White probably has to capture. Black takes it back. Queen takes, and now white has two connected passed pawns with the queen side comes up, and this move is now creating a problem for white, because if queen to b2, there's bishop takes a4, and that pawn is pinned, and black is absolutely fine. Meanwhile, queen to d2 allows black to recapture its pawn. White can play a5. Position is, well, it's maybe black still has some slight problems, but it's not very much. He should easily be able to contain the passed a pawn. White has to also tend to its safety. White's pieces are a little bit more active, but I think black should have enough counterplay here. So that was fine for black, apparently. Let's play king f8. And now g4. So white charges ahead with this attack. This was an interesting choice. There was also, again, this idea of bishop b5. Still, it's not that easy to see this idea. And then after black takes, queen takes b4. Once again, the same thing. And with the black king on f8, the knight pinned on e7, it's also pretty effective. So this was also strong. Carlsen chose g4. Now finally rook c3, because black realized the very serious nature of white's threats and realized that he simply was forced to find this idea. Since otherwise g5 is really fast. g5 takes and h6. After takes, queen takes, and then h6 is coming, and black's kingside rapidly falls apart. So black really needed counterplay quickly, so he played rook c3. g5, and black has to capture. There's nothing else good. So he takes. And this requires white to capture on c3, which is what black wants. Because obviously if queen takes g5 immediately, then rook takes d3. And white doesn't have, his attack isn't fast enough. Also, this knight is also hanging. So, meanwhile, if knight takes g5 and queen to d4, and black gets very powerful counter threats. This, queen g4, etc. So white had to first capture on c3, giving black this pass pawn. He takes c3, queen takes g5. Now the threat is h6. And this is, well, of course, this is very dangerous for black. He only has really one move here, so he played knight f5, trying to cover h6, making white have to take on f5 first and sacrifice a couple pawns to get to break through. If he tried this very solid defense, knight to g8, avoiding the capture and saying, okay, my knight's going to sit in this defensive position and hold everything together while I'm going to destroy white's queen side, well, that's logical, but the problem is now there's no communication, and black can't along black's ranks, and so he can't defend g7. So there's this very strong move, king h1, with the threat of rook to g1. And black doesn't get, black's play on the queen side really isn't fast enough. So white will break through, and also white's h-pawn would be very strong, and once, especially with the knight on g8, once white takes g7. If now queen takes f2, white just has to first play rook f1, and driving the queen away, and then rook c1. And once again, g7 falls, and black's play is not fast enough when white's taking g7, and then there will, after king e7, there will be queen g5, and taking the knight on g8, and there will also be knight to g5, or just a push of the h-pawn, so this is winning for white. So king h1 would be a very strong move. Black played knight f5 instead. Now king h1 isn't going to work because black will just take f2. So this knight is now an active participant in defense and counterattack. So white has to remove it. So takes f5. E takes f5, and now white needs to break through. h6 is covered by the black queen. So white first plays e6, interfering along the ranks, along the sixth rank. Black takes with bishop. If f takes e5, or f takes e6, this is obviously much worse because now this defender is gone. The pawn on f7 was a good defender. White would play h6. Black would have to take it, and then queen f6 check, king g8, and now there's many ways to win, such as queen g6, king f8, knight e5, with a crushing attack, threatening checkmate, also threatening the bishop, and bishop there, king f6, and then king h1 with the idea of rook g1. So black had to take with his bishop. Now h6, so white continues the breakthrough. G takes h6 and queen f6, not queen takes h6 because king e7 and the black king starts to run away. And once it reaches somewhere around c7 or somewhere over there, it's not easy for white to re-aim his pieces at the black king. And meanwhile, this pawn is a constant threat. So white played queen f6. With the threat, first threat, the main threat is queen h8 and taking the rook. So here, black, under pressure, probably intimidated by playing the world champion. And probably, I think, if I was watching live, I don't remember, but I think he was under time pressure or starting to approach it as well. Black now collapsed with playing king to g8, which leaves the king in the firing line, and white wins quickly. So black had really only one defense, and that was queen to d8, challenging the white queen. And if rook takes e6, then the black is able to go to the endgame, and then rook to c8, and this pawn can only be stopped at the cost of the knight. So then this endgame is reached. And now, for instance, if rook takes f5, d4, and most likely these pawns are going to be traded, and the game should end in a draw. Black will, of course, threaten this pawn and use the d pawn to divert the rook. So, most likely, if black had played queen to d8, Carlsen would have kept the queens on the board and played something like queen h8, king e7, queen c3, with a still very unclear position. I think I would take the white side here. Black, although black is up a pawn, that material count doesn't matter very much. The black king is in a little bit more danger. White king should be relatively safe on square. Well, the white king isn't completely safe either, but it looks like black king is in more danger. The bishop, of course, is like a big pawn, and white has these two connected passed pawns on the queen side. The knight can start jumping in. For instance, the d4 might be coming. Dark squares are weak, but at the same time, it's not easy to get at the black king. It hides behind this mass of pawns. It can jump one way or the other to f8 or to the queen side according to circumstances. And black isn't without counterplay. He can make a check on g8, and the white king can start to also feeling a little bit of heat. So it's a very sharp position. I think if pressed, I would take the white side. But Xiong didn't find the only move, queen to d8. So and it moves like rook to b8, for instance. I think here, for instance, white's, I believe, knight e5, and there's there's many threats such as knight to g6 check, and I don't think black can defend this position. So also knight to d4 looks good. So instead, black played king to g8, hoping to step out of this firing line, but now white simply placed queen takes h6, and the main threat is to move the king and just give a check on the g file. So it's a little bit slow with king h1, rook g1, and it's really not possible for black to defend against that because he just has no control over the dark squares. He played queen to b4, and after king h1, black resigned because rook g1 is coming next, and black would just have to give up the queen, and it's not getting anywhere. With the c-pawn's not going anywhere. White would quickly renew the attack. If he played queen takes b3, then king h1 wouldn't be right because black would have rook takes g4 and then block with the rook on g4. But after queen takes b3, white just plays knight to g5, and now there's white's threatening. Okay, obviously queen h7, queen h8, and just taking the rook is one thing. If black protects the rook, then there's knight h7, typical maneuver, and there's no defense against knight f6 check. Including black can play queen g4 check, but after king h2, white just gets out of the rhythm of checks. So that's it. So I think this was a pretty interesting game. It's interesting to watch a world champion playing against very strong but not quite at his level GMs. I think very instructive as well. I think there were elements of psychology involved in this game as well, as there always are in chess. Such moves like knight e5, rather than giving black knight e5 was, I don't think, the right move, but e4 would have set black a more limited task, I think. And, so he wanted to, and also h4 move, somewhat provocative. So I think both of these moves had elements of psychology in them. So this has been Grandmaster Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com.